nation, your news, One American News Network.
Merced County Sheriff revealed in the last 30 minutes a handwritten 2-page manifesto was just found on Muhammad today during the autopsy. In it, he lists names of students he wanted to zip tie to desks and harm after being kicked out of a study group. He planned to steal a gun from responding police officers and use it to commit other tragedies on the UC Merced campus. The sheriff says Muhammad laid out his plan carefully, but things didn't go according to plan.
In the past week alone, we've seen shootings in Maine, in Oakland, California, and in San Diego. The media jumped on these stories, quick, as usual, to politicize the tragedies and call for gun control. But what about stabbings? Where's the anti-knife brigade? 4 people were wounded at the University of California, Merced this week. But this time, it wasn't an attack with a gun. It was a hunting knife. A knife, the Merced County Sheriff claimed, had a blade 8 to 10 inches long. Following the attack, the alleged assaulter was shot by campus police. Here with me today to discuss this story is law enforcement professional and active shooter expert Chris Grollnek. Chris, great to have you back.
Hey Liz, thanks for having me back again.
On Monday, we talked about active shooting and what the best course of action to take is in those situations. So let's talk about active stabbing today. How is this different situationally? How should people react in situations like the one that occurred at UC Merced?
You know, it's strange that we talked about it probably 2 days before that the incident at Merced happened. And we even mentioned that, you know, to be an active shooter event or an active aggression event, which we typically refer to as a critical incident, it doesn't have to have a knife or a gun. We talked about the car at Oklahoma, and then lo and behold, a stabbing happens the next day, and it's not getting the same attention that everything else does. In that, and in my opinion, even if it were a gun in Merced, because this looks like it's going to be a homegrown domestic terrorist attack. The guy's manifesto came out. I've got inside knowledge of what it said. It does, you know, he was screaming phrases like Ali Akbar. He was mentioning the Prophet Muhammad. There's a lot more to the manifesto that's coming out, what the news media is privy to. And it's not that I have more information than the news media. I've called some friends on the ground and talked to them about it. Now, this person not only stabbed 4 people and then was shot and killed himself. In realistic terms, it would be much better to have him in custody to debrief him and find out what happened. But what a brave construction worker that interrupted him, right? He did exactly what we preach. Not necessarily attack as a last resort, but, you know, deter the person committing these heinous acts and stop them from occurring, because what he did was he distracted him. That's exactly what we just talked about on Monday.
Right, you talked about how the best thing to do in those situations is to distract from the attack in order for yourself and others to get away safely. And I think that kind of advice is very valuable. I do want to talk about the insider information that you have. You say you don't necessarily have information the news doesn't have. You're just on the ground involved in the response to these sort of incidents. Is there indication that this individual was inspired by ISIS?
So there's a lot of different information floating around out there, and part of the inside track would be it was inspired by ISIS, but it wasn't directed by, if you will. So it was kind of, you know, the kid watched some wacky videos and decided, you know, he was going to make a really cool plan in his mind. Because remember, these people, although maybe a little demented, they're very intelligent because they study the behavior and the successes, and no one of these people that are involved in any of these incidents have ever been, if you will, ready to fail. Their biggest fear is failure. So, you know, I don't know that it's fair to say that it was ISIS inspired, other than in his twisted mind that he watched ISIS videos and said, oh, I'm going to do something like Garland. And I just don't think the news media, the mainstream media, I don't think the publishing media, written media, or even syndicated radio hosts are prepared to talk about another homegrown terrorist attack, because what aren't we talking about directly like other countries are? The airline bombing. I mean, we know at this point that it was a bomb that went off in that airplane. We know it was a terrorist attack. We know Russians died. We know they suspended flights, but we don't want to talk about what's going on here because there's just too much at stake.
Right. Our media is very hesitant to talk to talk about Islamic terrorism because they're almost afraid to use that word. Now, would you say, if you wouldn't go as far to categorize it as inspired by ISIS, is it encouraged by ISIS? Because I know they have very concerted efforts online, on message boards, on videos, on social media, to recruit these very same type of homegrown terrorists. They want to inspire people to take up arms against the country that they live in if they consider the country to be evil, as they do with the United States. Is that a fair assumption to make at this point?
Absolutely, Liz. And I mean, I'll share with you something I've never shared on any network. So the main difference between an active shooter event, or what we call a critical incident, because this is like an active shooter event, it's just with a blade. And I hate to say that because I'm not trying to besmirch the victims by any means. But the only difference between an active shooter event and a terrorism attack is terrorist attacks are motivated by religious, ideological, and political goals and objectives. Now, that's what this kid was motivated by. He found a video, he found some type of objective, he was motivated, and he went out and carried it out. An active shooter event is more in tune with, they want to get even with people. Now, this one kind of crosses both lines because in his manifesto, he specifically picked out other freshmen that had kicked him out of clubs, and then he said, okay, well, I'll show you, I'll go find new friends. And that's kind of where the terror side came in to play, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that's not a reason that we shouldn't discuss both ends and they overlap, because something I have said on the news before is these things do overlap. There is an active shooter event that can become a domestic terrorist event or a global terrorist event, and global terrorists, use active shooters as one of their main methods. Look at the Kenya mall shooting and bombing. They used AK-47s for hours, shooting at will, Mumbai attacks. I can probably name 30 right now off the top of my head.
Right, so this incident, and that's very interesting to discuss, I want to focus on this a little, is that there's an overlap between an active shooter, which is usually motivated by revenge, and terrorism, which is motivated by political ideology or religious ideology. And in this incident, it seemed like the perpetrator was first motivated by revenge. He was an outcast. He felt like people were out to get him or wouldn't include him. So he said, okay, well, I'm going to get rid of you and I'm going to find new friends. The new friends that he found might have been online, might have been the ISIS propaganda that inspired him. And that's where it crossed over into terrorism. Is that an accurate assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, he used the model that an active shooter would use to go get revenge, but he sought his revenge through an ISIS-inspired, and I just contradicted myself. Not necessarily inspired, but
encouraged or motivated.
Thank you. It motivated attack style, and then he got his blade, wrote his manifesto, and went to carry it out, and he wanted to use a gun. I mean, just thank God that he was distracted long enough that he didn't. And let's just remember right quick that, sorry, from Texas, let's just remember for a minute, these terrorist attacks, terrorists and active shooters, if you will, let's look at their age group. There's no profile for an active shooter, but there is one for a terrorist. An active shooter is as young as 5-year-old girls to 96-year-old men. A terrorist is generally between 18 and 26. They're male, and they want to cause a lot of damage. Now, we are having some gender crosses happening with female suicide bombers, like the Halifax Mall in Canada. That did not happen, thank goodness, for great intelligence, and we can talk about that another day. But we have a profile for terrorists. We really need to shore that up with the FBI and the Joint Counterterrorism Task Force. That's some breaking news. We're trying to work with them right now with several universities, and we want to help put together some type of behavioral modification or behavioral model, if you will, that might help stop these things long before they happen. I can talk to you all day long about how to prevent them, how to survive them, and technologies like the Guard 911 we talked about just on Monday, or True Armor to buy yourself time when you're inside. But what about it? What if we could stop them on the way to their objective? Wouldn't that be great?
That would be ideal. Yeah, you'd think that would be the goal that all law enforcement agencies would work towards, the prevention of these incidents, not just the mitigation. Let's touch quickly on the knife attack aspect. So media aside, we don't have time to go into the double standard of the media, but in regards to the knife attack, I read today or yesterday that in Palestine, Palestinians are being encouraged, the terrorists there are being encouraged to attack Israelis with knives now, not just with guns, not just with bombs, not just with suicide attacks, but with knives just like this one. Should we expect to see more knife attacks coming up in the near future?
Yeah, Liz, I try to stay away from predicting. However, based off historical perspective data, it's not too hard to imagine that guns are going to be very, whether we have new gun laws or we don't, they're still a little bit hard to get. We know that. And we know that they encourage people to use them as often as possible. However, I will say that knives are not that hard to get. Go in the kitchen and borrow one and then see what happens.
That's exactly what they were encouraging in Palestine. They were saying use the kitchen knife to go attack Israelis. They were specifically targeting the kitchen knife.
Meat cleavers, that's absolutely right. And I'll just briefly mention again, the same day of Sandy Hook, 22 children lost their lives in China by stabbings. And I never talk about child death. So the reason I am right now is because, you know what, it's prominent, it's happening. We need to be aware, get our head out of the sand, and start thinking about some not only prevention techniques, but post or pre-mitigation. And I'll tell you, I really believe it's a money thing, Liz. We're starting Safe to Safest, as I think you know, it's a nonprofit, and we are very involved in trying to stop these things long before they even happen.
Yeah, you're doing great work. And I think the topic of how the media covers gun attacks versus knife attacks is a topic for a different day. And I'd like to invite you back soon to talk about that. But Chris, thank you for joining us today. Coming up, the attack on Christianity continues. That's next.